They always told me I was too weak to succeed, but I proved them all wrong. Lena Carter stood at the center of the grand stage, her name flashing in brilliant lights across the massive billboard behind her. The sound of applause filled the auditorium, echoing off the walls like a roaring tide, a deafening reminder of how far she had come. Photographers crowded the front row, their cameras flashing like stars in the night sky. She should have felt invincible. This was the moment she had dreamed of for years, the moment she had fought for with every ounce of strength she possessed. And yet, beneath the dazzling spectacle, an unsettling weight settled in her chest. The voices she thought she had silenced long ago began to whisper again. They weren't the cheers of admiration from the audience. No, these were older voices, familiar and cruel. The ones that had told her she was chasing an impossible dream, that she was weak, that she would never make it. The memories came rushing back, dragging her to a time when success had seemed like a distant fantasy. In the small town where she grew up, ambition was treated like a disease, something dangerous that needed to be kept in check. There was no place for grand dreams in a world where survival was the priority. Her father had always been the first to remind her of that. A man hardened by years of struggle, he saw the world as an unforgiving battlefield, and in his eyes, Lena was too fragile to fight. She still remembered the nights she had spent watching him repair old machinery in their dimly lit garage, his voice a quiet rumble as he spoke about the realities of life. You think dreams will put food on the table? The world doesn't care what you want, Lena. It only cares what you can endure. Her teachers weren't any better. They never saw her as someone capable of anything beyond what was expected for a girl like her. Whenever she tried to speak up, to show that she was more than what they believed, she was dismissed before she even had the chance. They encouraged the boys to dream, to build, to take risks. But Lena? She was told to be practical, to choose a path that wouldn't set her up for disappointment. And then there was the label she had carried for as long as she could remember, the label of weakness. As a child, she had been sick often, her body frail and uncooperative. While other kids ran through the fields and climbed trees, she had been forced to watch from a distance, her body betraying her every time she tried to keep up. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. They called her fragile, incapable, someone who would never be able to handle the real world. No matter how hard she tried to prove otherwise, she always seemed to fall short. But despite everything, there was a fire inside her that refused to die. Late at night, when the rest of the world slept, she would sit in her tiny bedroom, reading articles about entrepreneurship, watching interviews of people who had built their own empires from nothing. She memorized their words, studied their strategies, and envisioned a future where she wasn't just another forgotten girl in a town that never believed in her. She wanted more. She wanted to break free. But wanting something and achieving it were two entirely different things. The moment she tried to take a step toward her dreams, reality hit her with full force. Every opportunity she sought was met with rejection. Every attempt to rise was met with someone pulling her back down. The people around her saw her efforts as nothing more than childish fantasies. Even Emily, her best friend and the only person who ever listened, had her doubts. "I believe in you, Lena," Emily had said one evening, her voice hesitant, but what if they're right? Those words had cut deeper than anything else, because a part of her feared the same thing. Still, she refused to give up. When she finally got the chance to meet with an investor, she had poured everything into her pitch, believing that this was it. This was the moment that would change her life. She had practiced every word, polished every detail, convinced that if she could just make them see her vision, they would believe in her as much as she did. But the moment she walked into that office, she knew she had already lost. The investor barely looked at her. His eyes skimmed over her presentation, disinterest evident in his every move. And when he finally spoke, his words shattered every piece of hope she had clung to. "She's too weak to handle success. She'll break the moment things get tough." He didn't even say it to her directly. He said it as if she wasn't even in the room, as if she didn't matter enough to be acknowledged. That night, she broke. Sitting alone in her tiny apartment, the weight of every failure, every doubt, Every cruel word came crashing down on her. She was exhausted. Maybe everyone had been right all along. Maybe she really wasn't strong enough. Maybe it was time to stop fighting. Tears burned her eyes as she stared at her reflection in the window. The girl looking back at her was tired, beaten down, on the edge of surrender. But then something shifted. A memory surfaced. One of the countless moments when she had been told she couldn't do something. And yet here she was. She had made it this far, hadn't she? Hadn't she already defied their expectations just by refusing to disappear? She was tired of being told what she couldn't do. Slowly, she wiped her tears away, her hands trembling but determined. If they thought she was weak, she would prove them wrong. If they thought she would break, she would show them what she was made of. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Lena's days blurred into a cycle of exhaustion and relentless effort. She worked every shift she could find, early mornings at the local diner, late nights cleaning offices, and whatever odd jobs she could squeeze in between. Her feet ached, her back throbbed, and sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford. But she didn't care. Every dollar she earned brought her closer to her dream. During her short breaks, she devoured online courses, scribbling notes onto the back of receipts and napkins. She watched business tutorials on her cracked phone screen, absorbing every piece of knowledge like her life depended on it. She didn't have a mentor, a financial safety net, or even the faintest reassurance that she was doing the right thing. All she had was her unwavering belief that if she worked hard enough, if she sacrificed enough, success would come. But the world around her didn't share her faith. The people in town scoffed when they saw her reading business books between shifts. They whispered behind her back, shaking their heads at her silly dreams. Lena Carter? Starting a business? She'll be begging for her old job back in a year. One of her former classmates sneered as she walked by. Even her family refused to take her seriously. Her father, ever the realist, dismissed her ambitions with a tired sigh. You're chasing shadows, Lena. Stop wasting your time and get yourself a steady job. You'll thank me later. The loneliness of it all weighed on her. She had expected struggles, but not this crushing isolation. It was one thing to fight against the odds, but another to do it completely alone. Emily was the only one who ever listened, the only one who hadn't laughed at her dreams. But even that changed the day Lena discovered the truth. For months, she had been working tirelessly on a grant application, her one chance to get the funding she needed. It was her lifeline. But just when she was about to submit it, she found out that Emily had applied for the same grant behind her back. The same friend who had always encouraged her, the one person she had trusted, had stolen her idea for herself. Lena stood frozen, the words on the screen blurring as she read Emily's name listed among the applicants. Her heart pounded, not just from shock but from the deep, gut-wrenching betrayal. Emily had known how much this meant to her. She had been there through every late-night breakdown, every whispered hope. And yet, she had done this. When she confronted Emily, the guilt in her eyes was undeniable. Lena, I didn't mean to hurt you, she stammered. I need this too. Lena's voice shook with disbelief. You could have told me. You could have been honest instead of pretending to support me while secretly competing against me. Emily looked away, unable to meet her eyes. I thought you'd get it, Lena. You of all people know how hard it is to make it. I didn't think you'd actually win the grant anyway. The words cut deeper than anything else. So even Emily hadn't believed in her. That night, Lena sat alone in her tiny apartment, staring at the flickering streetlights outside her window. The world had made it clear no one was going to hand her a chance. She was truly on her own. But instead of breaking, she let the pain fuel her. She threw herself deeper into her work, determined to succeed without anyone's help. If no one believed in her, she would prove them all wrong. Little by little, her efforts started paying off. Her online business, something she had been building in the background, began gaining traction. Orders trickled in, and for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. Every sale, every satisfied customer, was proof that she was capable. But just as she started gaining momentum, life hit her with another brutal blow. She had applied for a small business loan, believing it would give her the push she needed to expand. She had been so sure, so hopeful. But when the bank's rejection letter arrived, it felt like a slap in the face. Unfortunately, we do not find your business model sustainable, the words read. She could almost hear the investor's cruel words echoing in her head. She'll break the moment things get tough. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to break. She wasn't going to give up. If the world wouldn't give her a way forward, she would carve her own path. Lena sat at her tiny desk, surrounded by stacks of notes, an old laptop, and a phone with a cracked screen. The rejection from the bank still stung, but she refused to let it be the end of her story. If she couldn't get a loan, she would find another way. She dived into research, scouring the internet for every possible strategy to grow her business without financial backing. Late into the night, she watched videos on marketing, branding, and social media engagement. She studied successful entrepreneurs, analyzing how they built their businesses from the ground up. Slowly, she started implementing what she learned. She revamped her online store, made eye-catching content, and engaged directly with potential customers. Every post, every comment, and every interaction was an opportunity. But progress was slow, and doubts lingered in the back of her mind. Her savings were running out. The stress of trying to keep everything afloat was overwhelming. She skipped meals to stretch her budget and slept only a few hours each night. Every day felt like an uphill battle, and exhaustion threatened to crush her. Then, one evening, while checking her inbox, she saw a message that made her heart stop. A well-known business mogul, Samuel Carter, had come across her work. "I admire your persistence. Let's talk." Lena stared at the words, her hands trembling. It had to be a mistake. Why would someone like him be interested in her tiny business? She reread the message a dozen times before responding. A week later, she found herself standing outside a towering glass skyscraper, her stomach twisting in knots. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but now that it was here, fear gripped her. What if she wasn't good enough? What if he saw her the same way everyone else did? Too weak, too inexperienced, too small to matter. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The conference room was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Samuel Carter sat at the head of a long, polished table, his piercing eyes studying her as she walked in. "Lena Carter," he said, his voice measured. "I've been watching your work. Tell me, why should I invest in you?" Her throat went dry. Every insecurity, every moment of doubt from her past came rushing back. The investor's cruel words echoed in her mind. She'll break the moment things get tough. For a split second, she considered running. But then, she remembered. She remembered the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the pain of betrayal. She remembered all the times she had been told she couldn't, and how she had fought anyway. She lifted her chin and met Samuel Carter's gaze. "Because I don't break." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes assessing her. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass windows. Lena felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it crush her. She took a steady breath and continued, her voice firm despite the nervous pounding of her heart. "I started with nothing. No funding, no connections, just an idea and the determination to make it work. Every setback I faced, I turned into fuel. When banks denied me, I found other ways. When people doubted me, I pushed harder. I've built this from the ground up, and I'm not stopping now." Samuel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You talk a good game, but passion alone doesn't make a business successful." Lena swallowed, nodding. She had prepared for this. "I have the numbers to back it up. My online engagement has grown by over 300% in the last 3 months. My customer base is expanding, and I've managed to do it with almost no budget. Imagine what I could accomplish with the right resources." Samuel studied her for a long moment. Then, he leaned forward, folding his hands. "You remind me of myself when I started. Tell me, if I invest in you, what do you plan to do with it?" Lena's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment she had been working toward for years. She laid out her plan, how she would scale her business, expand production, and reach new markets. She spoke with confidence, fueled by every hardship she had endured. When she finished, Samuel nodded slowly. Then, to her utter disbelief, he reached for a folder, pulled out a document, and slid it across the table. "This is an investment agreement. I'll fund your business and open doors you never thought possible." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She reached for the papers, her fingers shaking slightly. "Why me?" she asked, still unable to believe this was real. Samuel gave a rare, approving smile. "Because you don't break." Tears burned in Lena's eyes, but she blinked them away. This was only the beginning. Months later, her business flourished beyond her wildest dreams. Her name was no longer whispered with doubt. It was spoken with admiration. Then came the moment she never expected. She was invited to a prestigious business gala, a symbol of everything she had fought for. Dressed in an elegant gown, she stepped into the grand hall, her head held high. And then she saw him. The investor who had once dismissed her, the man who called her weak, stood across the room. Their eyes met, and for a moment, she saw recognition flicker in his expression. But she didn't need his validation anymore. With a quiet smile, Lena turned away. She had already won. Lena stepped onto the grand stage, her heart pounding as the spotlight bathed her in golden light. The applause was deafening, a wave of sound crashing over her. For a moment, she simply stood there, drinking it in, the faces, the admiration, the undeniable proof that she had made it. Her name, once spoken with doubt and ridicule, now shone on a massive screen behind her. The words Self-Made Entrepreneur of the Year glowed beside it, a title she had earned with every tear, every sleepless night, and every battle fought alone. As she scanned the crowd, her gaze landed on familiar faces. Her father, Emily, and, to her surprise, the investor who once dismissed her without a second thought. Her father sat stiffly in the front row, his eyes unreadable, but he was there. That alone meant something. Emily stood further back, looking hesitant, regret etched into her features. And the investor, his expression was different now. No longer smug, no longer dismissive. Instead, he watched her with something close to admiration. But Lena hadn't come here for them. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, the microphone cool beneath her fingertips. "I used to believe success was about proving people wrong," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions swelling in her chest. "I thought if I could just work hard enough, if I could just push through every obstacle, I could silence the voices that said I wasn't good enough." The audience listened in rapt attention. "But I was wrong," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. "Success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. It's about knowing deep inside that you are capable before anyone else sees it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. She went on, speaking about the nights she had spent doubting herself, the sacrifices she had made, the pain of betrayal. But she also spoke about hope, about resilience, about what it meant to stand tall, even when the world tried to push you down. As she spoke, she met her father's gaze again. Something shifted in his expression. The harsh, disapproving lines that had once defined his face softened. For the first time in her life, he looked at her with something that resembled pride. And for Lena, that was enough. As the applause faded, Lena stepped off the stage, her heart still racing. The weight of her journey settled over her, not as a burden, but as a quiet triumph. She had spoken her truth, and the world had listened. As she made her way through the crowd, Emily appeared in front of her, hesitation in her eyes. The once confident friend who had betrayed her now looked small, uncertain. "Lena," Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Lena studied her for a long moment. She could see the regret, the shame. She could tell the words weren't empty. "I should have believed in you," Emily continued. "I should have stood by you instead of doubting you, she swallowed hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." Lena took a slow breath. She wasn't the girl who once craved validation. She didn't need Emily's belief anymore. But she understood the weight of regret, the pain of realizing you had lost something valuable. "I forgive you," Lena said finally. Emily's eyes welled with tears, but before she could say more, Lena added, "But trust, that takes time to rebuild." Emily nodded, understanding. They would never go back to what they were, but maybe one day they could be something new. Before Lena could take another step, a deep voice stopped her. "Miss Carter." She turned. The investor who had once dismissed her stood before her, his expression unreadable. "You've built something remarkable," he said, nodding toward the screen that still bore her name. "I misjudged you." He hesitated, then extended a hand. "I'd like to discuss a potential collaboration." Lena stared at him, remembering the sting of his past words. "She's too weak. She'll break the moment things get tough." She smiled, but not in acceptance. "Thank you," she said, "but I don't need your validation anymore." His face flickered with something, shock, perhaps even respect. But she had already turned away. As she moved through the room, her eyes caught on a young girl watching her with wide-eyed wonder. The same look Lena had once worn when she dreamed of something bigger. She walked toward the girl, a smile forming on her lips. Because success wasn't just about proving herself. It was about paving the way for the next dreamer.